Welcome, good day to all colleagues who are connected from different places of the world. So you are connected to this open online briefing offered by 4SD Foundation. You will hear first a briefing from Dr. David Nabarro, and then we will open the floor for your reactions, your compliments, your questions, hopefully engaging into a conversation. For today, the angle that David would like to explore with all of us is on how public health is evolving in the wake of the COVID-19 emergency. But he also would like to explore what's the impact of violent conflict on people's sustainable development. And last but not least, if we manage to cover all of this in our session, he would like to look into how the climate COP28 meeting that will be in Dubai starting at the end of November will explore the links between action on climate, on biodiversity, and at the same time with people's food, nutrition, water, and health scarcity. So big nexus that will be explored at this opportunity. Three big topics that are all connected in David's brain. So without long ado, Dr. Nabarro, I would like to invite you to explore those three topics for us.
So that's great, Florence. And I really want to acknowledge the rather exceptional group of people who gathered here today for the discussion. Just going round, particularly delighted to see Ad Spikers is with us. I think Ad is joining from Vietnam, but I'm not sure. I've already greeted Karen. Good. I've already greeted Karen Palmer, and who's joining from somewhere out on the Pacific side of North America, as far as I can tell.
Vancouver.
Very good. Jean-Luc Poncelet joining from Washington. Paul Garner from Liverpool, Marion Hasselgrave, not quite sure where from, but lovely to see you. Very good to see Sarah Phillips and Chris Langton, wonderful. And especially suddenly on my screen to find my brother William, that's great. Arnie Cartridge from Yarra, Sarah Phillips, Monica Marika, Denise, and Florence Segal. Hello, lovely to see you again. I want quickly to just remind ourselves that COVID-19 is what brought us together originally. And I've just been really interested in the latest epidemiological update on COVID-19 from the World Health Organization to see that the way in which the data are presented is implying a continued drop in the numbers of cases and the numbers of deaths that are attributed to COVID-19 during the month of September and October. And I asked myself, is this really what is happening? And I think my analysis really is conforming with what others are saying, that the virus continues to mutate, new variants continue to emerge, but the variants that do emerge and become permanently present in the human population are those which have lower impact on people's life expectancy. They are not killing people at quite the same rate as they were. But at the same time, they are more transmissible. And that was the pattern we were expecting. Greater transmissibility, less morbidity and mortality would be the evolving pattern of this virus. And so it is, as one might say, settling down. But at the same time, it's not. I mean, more and more now we realize that even though the virus seems to be much less unpleasant in terms of mortality, there are still some really frustrating side effects of the pandemic that we are having to contend with as humanity. The first is the continued presence of long-term symptomatology, some of it associated with continued physiological dysfunction in the body, and some of it associated with changes in the way in which the brain is helping the body to cope with the stress of an infection. Either way, for a small number of people, but it's absolutely not an insignificant number of people, long-term impacts on functioning, the long-term impacts on life expectancy are very much there. And the quality of the data are not very good. But what we're seeing is that long COVID or post-COVID symptomatology is still a major challenge. Second is the impact of COVID-19 between 2020 and the present on other aspects of people's lives beyond their physical health. And there, the recorded impact of COVID on education and the ability of children to be able to learn, and then the impact on mental health, and indeed on the structure of households, seems to be constantly being highlighted as something we need to pay attention to. The educational impact is identified by UNICEF as one that is continuing, and there's a whole cohort of children who have not done well because they've had between 1 and 2 years out of school. The mental health impacts are quite well documented, that there has been a big uptick in mental ill health associated with reactions to the pandemic. And the household impact are still being disentangled, but it does look as though this has been associated with damage to household structure and functioning in many locations. So the social impacts, societal impacts of COVID are still being untangled. And then the third thing is some work that I came across recently on the impact of COVID on health systems everywhere, and rather interesting piece of work that's come from North America on what has COVID told us about health systems in different parts of the world. Firstly, COVID has tested the resilience of health systems, the spare capacity to be able to work. Interestingly, it's argued by many that the US health system, with its very large number of practitioners available if you can afford to buy them, that system seems to have proved to be resilient, at least for wealthy Americans, but for poor Americans who are dependent more on Medicare, the resiliency has proved to be much less satisfactory. COVID has, however, led to increases in telemedicine use, and so that has opened up an advance, but interestingly, the levels of telemedicine being practiced have reduced recently in the US. Thirdly, COVID has had an enormous stress on the health labor force and is now reckoned to be associated with a much higher rate of burnout, particularly among nursing personnel, than was the case 4 years ago. And fourthly, COVID has led to politicization of public health in a way that I think many of us just never thought was going to occur. And there's a lot being learned now about how to react to politicization in public health, with most people saying, if you are dealing with politicization, be very careful as a public health practitioner not to try to play the same game, because you will not get much credit for it. So just for me, this remains very interesting. I shall continue in these briefings to look at the consequences of a politicization of public health, just been writing about it, because it has a big impact on the way in which emergency health responses can be organized if people are working for different political masters, getting them all under a single command and even under command and control from a single source becomes incredibly difficult. And so the politicization that seems to be appearing is making the management of emergency responses much harder, and is calling on all of us who work in public health to be thinking about more efficient ways of working with groups of practitioners who work for different political masters, and to find ways to enable them to have effective leadership arrangements. And so that has become a particular challenge, and is one that I will go on looking at. So in summary, resilience depends hugely on the kind of health system it is. Where you've got a lot of quite independent providers, perhaps resilience hasn't been badly affected. But if the system is got very limited numbers of providers, then resilience has been reduced. Telemedicine has been increased. Labor forces have definitely been super stressed, and burnout has increased, and politicization of public health is very much on the increase, and we, I think, have not collectively learned how to deal with it. That was my first area I wanted to focus on. The second area I want to focus on, it relates to public health and health systems in situations where violence is being used as a means to try to resolve conflicts. We've seen violence being used to resolve conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, and that continues. We're seeing violence being used in increasing numbers of locations around the world. The conflict monitors are all pointing to an uptick in the frequency with which violent conflict is being practiced. And now we are living real time in a very acute situation of substantial violence in Gaza, an area that many of us have been to and worked in perhaps, but certainly one where the population is 100% dependent on the force that is currently controlling access to that population, and is also 100% dependent on the goodwill of the people who are controlling access to keep that access open. And right now, the willingness to do so is zero. And so we are seeing in 2023 a siege involving over 1 million people in real time. The impact of that siege on the health and well-being of the people in Gaza will be very hard to assess in real time, because we will find it hard to trust the information that comes out. There's been a lot of material in the newspapers I read, for example, on whether or not the mortality figures produced by the Gaza Health Department are to be trusted. And it is often said that they cannot be trusted because the Gaza Health Department is run by Hamas, and Hamas is the enemy of the force that is laying siege to Gaza. And so getting the numbers and information is extremely difficult. But that does not take away from the reality that those of us who work in public health find sieges to be very difficult to deal with. We had it, of course, in the Balkans and in the past, and we've had it in locations in other parts of the world as well. It's not uncommon, but a siege of this magnitude in terms of numbers of people involved is quite unprecedented in modern times. And so it is desirable to think that through from a public health perspective and consider the kind of positioning we all need to take. Now, it's a bit difficult, this one, because many of us might either have relatives or friends who are living in Israel or who align with the Israeli position. And that makes it extremely difficult to focus on the public health consequences of this siege, and indeed the moral basis of this siege in conversations that we might have. But there are one or two people on this call who I know will be interested to raise this as a question, and it fits with some of the work we do on systems leadership in public health. And so I would be quite comfortable if this is something that anybody does wish to raise and to comment on. Jean-Luc Poncelet, who worked with me in the World Health Organization on crisis response, is extremely familiar with and sophisticated on these kinds of issues. And I would like to encourage you in the discussion phase, if you wish, Jean-Luc. I'm looking at the camera at the moment, so I can't tell whether you're still on. Yes, you are, you're there. You may well have a position on this and wish to talk about it or not. Third thing I wanted to refer to was the work that we're doing applying a systems lens to food. And as I've discussed in previous briefings, but not all of you will have heard, with colleagues, we have been encouraging an approach to food systems that gets the different stakeholders who have a stake in the food system in their community to focus on the way that food system should evolve through multi-stakeholder dialogue. Now, this is not dialogue just simply to talk. This is dialogue as a basis for collective action. And it starts from the assumption that because food is a systems issue, in any setting, there will be multiple perspectives on how to move forward on food. Those perspectives will all have validity on the basis that they are perceived and expressed by people who are active players within the local food system. And instead of trying to deal with these multiple perspectives by trying to shut down some of them through force of persuasion, through science, through finance, or even through coercion, our approach on food is to say the dialogues yield perspectives that all have value, and it's therefore necessary to work on the future of food using a dialogic approach that seeks to get collective agreement and action to shift on the basis of shared identity, open relationships, sharing of information and trust, rather than by any effort to try to get people onto the same page. That means that you have to work on the system, recognizing and accepting that diversity, discord, even tension is going to be there whatever happens. And you could say, well, you can't do that. It doesn't work. There's too much dispute. I'm going to say that's how all societies have functioned for multiple centuries, because there's always in any society been differences of opinion and differences of view. And it's only in quite modern parlance that we've moved to the point of requiring uniform values, uniform positioning, uniform strategic choices as a basis for moving forward. It becomes indeed somewhat disturbing with this request for uniformity of positioning, if that at the same time leads to intolerance of certain groups. And just to connect with what I was talking about before on the impact of violence and violent conflict on public health, you could probably see that me as a systems thinker and a systems actor, I is quite worried about the emerging requirement from certain governments of their people to show that they support one side or other in the current siege situation in Gaza, because if it becomes necessary for governments to require a particular allegiance, that can have quite an interesting impact on the positions taken by different people, and most importantly, requiring people to have allegiances makes it very difficult to create the climate within which you can get a system to shift and differences of opinion accepted within those systems as part of what life should bring. So I want to just say to you that any effort to try to align people and to require an allegiance and faith in that alignment can be quite counterproductive when you're working for medium to long-term development. So in our work on food, we take a systems approach. We have been encouraging food systems transformation without requiring similar position taking by people. We do not say everybody's got to agree to eat less meat, or everybody's got to agree to produce their food using agroecological techniques, because we just think that that kind of unitary prescription is not helpful. But we are after one thing, which is convergence of ideas where this becomes possible. And one area where we're trying to encourage convergence at local level, at national level, and beyond is on the growing recognition that agriculture and food systems, as well as people's nutrition and well-being, is being very much disturbed by accelerating climate change and the rate at which biodiversity is being reduced. Climate change and damage to nature, reduction of biodiversity, are making food systems more vulnerable, making food systems less reliable in more and more places at this time. And we believe that the issues of climate and nature on the one hand, and food and nutrition on the other hand, benefit greatly from efforts to converge them within governments, within business, within professions, within society. Because if they stay separate, then this will lead to food system evolution that will be, in general, unsatisfactory. So we are working as 4SD Foundation for the convergence of climate and nature with food and nutrition from the perspective of farmers, particularly young farmers, and trying to get this convergence applied in as many countries as possible, particularly focusing on the countries where we have been supporting food systems transformation pathways and their implementation. So I wanted to raise that because I think every single one of us works in spaces where progress is inhibited because of lack of convergence, or perhaps another term might be siloed behavior within governments or within organizations. And I will be interested if anybody wishes in the discussion to spend a bit of time thinking about practical ways of reducing siloed behavior and encouraging convergence. I've talked about climate and nature and food and nutrition, my example, but you may well have examples from your own practice and simple tips that you might want to share. Because one of the things I've learned is that there's often siloed behavior in government, simply because people have not quite found the tricks that can reduce it and can encourage crosswalks between the silos and collective working. Well, if any of you who've got tips you'd like to share, and I'm wanting to say to Sarah Phillips, I'm sure you've got some ideas, please don't hesitate to share them. Right, those are my introductory remarks. And I go back to Florence Lasbennes. I see Florence Egal's put up her hand, but Florence Lasbennes as our chair to help moderate us through. Just to remind three things: the COVID-19 story and where public health is going, use of violence to resolve conflict and what that's meaning right now in health terms, particularly in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And then thirdly, the potential for convergence when we're dealing with siloed behavior, and what practical experience do we have to share? Flo, back to you.
Well, thank you, David, as usual, for this very insightful briefing. And before giving the floor to Florence Egal for everybody, so this is the part of the briefing where you are invited to share your own reactions, thoughts. Of course, welcome to agree, disagree, challenge anything that's been said before you, and to have the floor attract my attention, either with your virtual hand or by a gesture or by a text message, whatever. But for now, we are going to Florence Egal. Florence, please.
Thank you very much. Just let me switch off the CFS. Can't do the two things at the same time. Okay, no, I really like to follow up on what David said before of the need to bring together climate and nature on one side and food and nutrition on the other and bring them together. Let's give an example out of most people's area of interest at this stage. If you're going to do that in northern Cameroon, if you're going to do that in southern Cameroon, you're not going to get the same approaches. So it's going to be very important, for example, to recognize that in much of the Sahel, the constraints and opportunities, and therefore the climate, nature, food, and nutrition dimensions have a lot of commonalities. And they should probably be discussed outside and beyond national borders. But this applies a bit everywhere. So if we want to talk climate and nature, let's go back to the maps our environmental colleagues do. And let's say, okay, with that climate, that geography, these are the constraints, and how do we link there? And it's going to be easier to look closer to the ground to deal with these issues. The second issue is that of human rights. We have human rights that have been adopted for a long time, and we have international human rights. And I think this is what should help us also as a tool to guide what how we react or how we deal with a given crisis. It's going to be very important to build on that. And I just want to remind David, in case he's forgotten, that when we met, it was in 1986, working with UNRWA, medical doctors in Palestinian refugee camps. So I think that we all got involved in these kind of discussions a long, long time ago. So it's not new. Thank you.
That was in Larnaca, wasn't it? Or something? We were working with the UNRWA doctors. They came to training.
It was Larnaca, but I had to do the preparatory work and go and see them in their different camps before that. And then the big boss came and we did the proper workshop.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Florence. I'm even intrigued that you did not use the term territoire or local ecosystem. I thought that's the direction you were taking. Look into convergence between climate, food, nature, and all those issues at the local level.
I'm to localization of SDGs.
Yes, yes, yes.
But of course, I mean, territorial approaches, urban-rural linkages, and all that jazz. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. Let's continue our conversation, turning to Arne Cartridge, please.
Hi, Florence, and hi, David. And it's a little bit of a question back to you, David, but you touched upon mental health related to COVID and the pandemic. But somehow, you know, if you talk about the increased conflict and also civil unrest that we see across the world, and the cost of living and the food systems that you touched upon. But how with kind of our individual resilience or our mental health or our capacity to deal with what seems to be an increasing and somewhat for many depressing kind of outlook. So beyond the pandemic, the mental health challenge, given kind of the state of the world.
Important point, and knowing the work you are doing, David Nabarro, with Imperial College, I thought you might want to say a few things about this topic on mental health before we turn to Jean-Luc.
Thanks very much indeed. There's a deputy health commissioner in New York called Gary Belkin, who's responsible for mental health in the city. And he has said to me on several occasions that from his perspective, the atomization of our society has actually made us much less resilient as a race or as a species to cope with shocks and stresses, especially those that are existential and that we might view as threatening our collective existence. So he says, first, we must concentrate on rebuilding the relationships that are necessary for society to be capable of adapting to new circumstances. And secondly, we need to apply ourselves in a very deliberate way, an intentional way, to the existential challenges that collectively we face, taking account of how they impact on different individuals and social groups. He was very keen that we should collectively focus on the kinds of human organization needed to deal well with a threat like COVID-19. But he said, and particularly when I met him and heard from him in 2021 and 2022, he said, it's going to be absolutely essential that to help equip us as societies to cope with the gradual but then accelerating increased impact of climate change, that we've got to look at how we connect with each other. And he set up a thing called Care of People and the Planet, which was called COP Squared, and this is going to get quite a lot of an outing over the coming months, and I think it's wonderful. And he stimulated somebody called Emma Lawrence to move forward with a thing that Dr. Emma Lawrence, that she has wanted to do in a time at Imperial College, which is to establish a program and then a center that works on interactions between the climate emergency and people's mental health and emotional resilience. Because Emma has argued that it's an emergency now to work on human resilience in the face of climate change, because without that, societies are going to find adapting to the new circumstances of altered weather impossible to do. And so Emma Lawrence and team are busy working on this center. They have a grant from the Wellcome Trust to look at the field of research at the intersection between climate change and mental health. And Arnie, now that you've told me that this is an area that you might be interested in, I'd very much like to connect you with them. And anybody else who's interested, I really would encourage you to look up Emma Lawrence, Lawrance, who is at Imperial College and accessible via all search engines. She is really a remarkable force of nature, and the combination of her and Gary Belkin is something very special. Thank you, Flo.
Fascinating. Thank you, David. We turn to Jean-Luc Poncelet, but I want to acknowledge also the messages and questions in the chat. We'll cover them in a few minutes. For now, Jean-Luc, the floor is yours.
Recording. Thank you. David, I don't think I will take your invitation to talk about Gaza. That's an impossible question.
I've known you for long enough to know that you'll fling it straight back at me if you don't want to take the bait. Okay, got that.
Look, no, I think that the position from the humanitarian community is very clear. You need an assessment of needs, you need to have entry, you need to have access, and access is the obvious main blockage in that one. So that reminds us, Henri Dunant reason or raison d'être is more important than ever. And we are quite concerned that the Red Cross, the Red Cross Society might not have the space that is required in that type of event. That's more than ever, more than the UN that is quite politicized at some point of time. I think that the Red Cross movement has more sense than ever to develop that and publish that aspect of neutrality has been absolutely needed. So we go back to Napoleon Wars and Solferino. But I think coming on your point of working in silo, I think that the strength of our society is to work in silo, and the weakness is to work in silos. So I think the combination that we have today is really to connect one and the other. So how can we be performant by being focused? Isolate a virus in a lab is a wonderful thing, but it's not reality, but it helps quite a lot. So I think the only thing I think that we have now is to work much more. And I think, David, you're inviting us to make much more research in that field. So now in the disaster field, there is a cascading approach, the systemic risk analysis and cascading effect of crisis that start to identify, for example, adapting to our world of public health. How can I, as public health officer, be conscious of what we can do in public health, but also the effect that it has on the rest of society? The impact that we see on children today has been a great result of locking people in their house. And a number of public health people generally out loud, publish those messages because obviously for a public health point of view, exposing ourselves to a virus is obviously the first reason of being exposed to the disease. And so the consequence of what we have been saying and collectively recognizing, I think has to be fine-tuned, obviously extremely complicated. And I think the modeling of cascading disaster or cascading effect of our technical recommendation has to progress. And I think very interesting, is a very interesting field that developed now. So I will encourage all of us to look at putting our science, being focused, but look at what's something that may seem minor in our perspective can be of high consequence, for example, for children in the next generation. Over.
Very interesting, David. And I see you jumping. Come in.
No, yeah, it just, Jean-Luc once again has stimulated me no end. You see, on the one hand, yes, there's a rationale for siloed behavior, whether it's in government or in universities or in the church or wherever, because it enables, firstly, strategic focus, secondly, accountability, who's supposed to be held to account, and thirdly, the identification also of responsibility, that if you're siloed, it's quite easy to say X is responsible because it's in their purview. And all that makes sense. If you're trying to run a government, trying to run an organization, trying to run a business, there's a lot to be said for having things divided up. And yet, when it comes to serving people and responding to their needs, it's the last thing you need. And so I agree with you, Jean-Luc, that it's something that warrants constant work by all of us. And it's lovely to see in the chat that there are a number of people describing projects that have been put in place to combine that tight focus with also wide-ranging work, especially when dealing with issues where there are dependencies and synergies, and especially when dealing with communities that are facing major difficulty. And so I don't feel that we have solutions, but I think that in this group, there are people with a lot to offer. I'm going to hold that. Thank you. Great. Quiet again.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. We turn to Sarah Phillips, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm in Lusaka at the moment. I've just come up from Lower Zambezi, which is lovely. Just trying to see the rural communities. It's thriving. Lusaka is just thriving, and it just filled me with so much hope. Out in the rural areas, I'm not sort of seeing that. I'm here on a business trip really, and seeing a friend here as well. So I'm here for another week. But regarding working in silos and the work I'm getting to at the moment, I've been in a year in the integrated care system, which is it's outward facing, so it's 70,000 colleagues. I'm in the people function, I was in culture and improvement, and now in leadership and talent. And it's been it's such a privileged role. It's fascinating. It's like a microcosm. It's a big microcosm, but it's like a microcosm of what's happening in places and how people are taking this forward from very much a command control industry, really, sector, NHS, but by being outward facing, it's there. Now, there's some of the things that I'm finding at the moment. So the encouraging dissonance and holding that dissonance has really helped me. So I keep thinking when it's really tough and it's really a challenge, holding that and reminding myself, even though I've had other training, but coming here to help with that and thinking it's okay, encourage. So that definitely works. And VUCA, so people are starting to understand VUCA. A year ago, I showed a picture that was shared to me by a consultant for NHS England. And she said, should I show it? And I said, I'll show it in small groups. And now we're starting to be able to share it in wider groups. And people go, yeah, that's what's happening. That's where we're at, which is the things that we talk about. And that reminded me of in lockdown, when David talked about, he would be about 3 weeks ahead of our government. And it was so reassuring to kind of know that somebody had foresight of that. For me, it was like quite clear. And what I'm finding is I can offer some of that with my team around me and colleagues that think in this way, so that where I found systems thinking, and John talked about it another meeting or so ago, that it doesn't, I've got a master's in systems and leadership stuff, but you don't have to have that, you've got to have that mind. And I think dispelling that myth is really helping, and people are going, oh, okay, so they're seeing the whole. NHS England's just brought out a new course as well. That's been brilliant. And then the other thing was power imbalances and things. I think when we've got this sort of what we call heavy splitting, which is quite, many will be used to it, but where things are really stressful, where it's really hard to think, it's just so tiring to think. Black and white thinking will kick in with big societies, big groups, and big. So taking that, knowing that, and trying to take away some of the workload of thinking, so the containment and the if you do know, you can see something as a leader further ahead. That seems to work. And then the biggest one I've got that's working well, making my life a lot easier when I go back to work at the ICS is, so people were concerned about the systems thinking and the whole picture. The NHS is super fast. When I left, you did 3 jobs. Now you do 10 jobs and you do it super fast. So there's this pace, this cut and all sorts of stuff. So what's working is we've gone through a approach culture leadership program, and UE, I think it's called Bristol University, came in and did some synthesis work. So I've used that to give people confidence. It's not me being a bit wacky. And this is a good one. So they're really comfortable with collective leadership and distributed decision making. That's working really well. The people are finding that containing to go, I see now, because suddenly there's a decision made when you're working in this way, and somebody that's got statutory responsibilities haven't got sight of it, so that's affecting things. And that's the key thing. But one of the other things was so many bottles in beautiful Zambia all along the roadside, and all this plastic everywhere. It just, you know, it's just shocked me a little bit. So there's some brilliant things, and then there's some other things that you think, gosh, here we are. I think that's plenty, isn't it? So thank you very much for having me, and it's great to see everyone. Sorry I'm a bit travel worn.
Well, thank you for taking the time to connect to this briefing, Sarah, on the road as you are traveling. David, any reaction?
Yeah. Number one, I mean, inside Sarah's weave, I found some things that I really want to pick out and play with. First, she is saying that she is feeling pleased with her emerging ability to encourage and hold dissonance in the group she is working with. I think that's something I'd like to encourage everybody to play with for a bit. That actually, when systems leadership works, it is capable of containing multiple perspectives on issues without that leading to fractures in the functioning of the entity, or indeed to bust-ups between individuals because they have different perspectives. It's holding the dissonance without there needing to be destructive, interpersonal, or intra-organizational battles. And I thought, perhaps, Sarah, what you're telling me, and I hadn't thought of it before just now, is that this is one of the really kind of high order characteristics of successful systems leadership. Second was Sarah's use of this acronym VUCA, which, if I've got it right, it stands for vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which are characteristics of societies that are under stress and have lost their way. But at the same time, many of us believe that this is actually a characteristic of all societies, and that it's better if those are accepted and this is brought into systems leadership. And in particular, when you're looking at a whole big system picture, you can build into it the VUCA challenges without being paralyzed. And that's the thing. Can you cope with the vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and at the same time not be challenged? Lastly, the point that Sarah made about how sometimes when people are encouraged to think in systems, they can get very scared of it. It is, for many, a scary concept. And although I didn't quite get, because I lost the sound, everything that Sarah was saying, and we can talk about it more later, there is something in what Sarah said about helping people to cope with the stress that comes with being invited to think in systems. Sarah, if I got that completely wrong, you will put a thumbs down and say rubbish, but I hope no, it was all right. Good. So that's my reaction. Beautiful. Thank you very much indeed, once again, for sharing your hands-on experience. It's beautiful.
Can't agree more. And we keep going for 10 more minutes with more experience. I think Paul Garner, and I think Spikers, you are trying to raise your hand also. So let's go to Paul first and then to Ad.
Slightly off the wall example, but in the management of the post-COVID condition, as David was saying earlier on, part of it's related to the virus and part of it's to do with how the brain controls the body. And you know, you mentioned the difficulty when groups require allegiances. And all we're trying to do is say to people, we know there's this problem, but psychology and psychological approaches may help you get better, and it also gives you agency. The problem is that the ideologues on the other side immediately reject that they require it to be rejected. They say you're gaslighting people, you're saying it's all in the head, you've got to wait until the doctors sort it out. And that's not what we're saying. And it is a problem when the activists then attack you, requiring people to stand in the biomedical camp or the psychological camp. And what they do is they completely poison the argument by saying, you're just saying it's all in the head and it isn't, and gaslighting. So what we've learned is just to ignore all of that and just keep talking, because actually the people you're talking to may not be the people that are constantly requiring the allegiance or trying to separate you. It's the people in the middle who are not quite clear about it, and the people that need help, and the other doctors that haven't quite made up their mind. So we just sort of keep going. We're not exactly ignoring them, but certainly not attacking them. But it is quite difficult when activist groups are requiring these allegiances. So thanks for pointing out that facet that I could relate to my own experience.
And Paul, thank you again for tuning into that. I'm as grateful to you for doing so. There's an interesting Canadian clinical psychologist called Jordan Peterson, who's written a book called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. I'm not encouraging you necessarily to go and read his book if you haven't read it already, but I just want to say that one of his points that he makes very strongly in his book, based on his clinical psychology practice, is the absolute need for an awful lot of people to find people who have value systems that align with their own. And his point is that quest for people with similar value systems can become quite a dominant feature of how people seek out those that they're prepared to relate to and work with. But it has the disadvantage that then means that people tend to congregate with, work with, and value folk with similar ideologies to their own. And I was just thinking when Paul Garner was saying that groups require allegiances, that Jordan Peterson's analysis of the importance of value systems seems to come to the same space. And there's something very fundamental, almost visceral in this about human nature, Paul. I think that those allegiances become a dominant feature in people's lives. If you think I'm wrong, just say so, but it's for something, ever since we've been talking about this and the issue you faced about tribes and camps on long COVID, I've thought to myself, what's driving this? And it seems to me it's something to do with that quest for an allegiance. Over.
I'd agree. It's sort of social identity theory suggests people need to hold on to this set of beliefs and reject others that might say something different. We're simply asking people to be a bit more open to other possibilities. But this total rejection keeps them in their own space. The problem is that they take a lot of other people with them in this polarization, and they're the people that you want to kind of try and persuade before they get too locked into this way of life and this way of thinking. So we just keep going. But I like that, and I 12 Rules for Life, I could do with a few myself, so I'll check that book out. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Paul and David. We keep going with Ad Spikers, please.
Good evening, good afternoon. I speak indeed from Hanoi, David, and all the other colleagues of the SD. Thank you for your mentorship, and I encourage you to go ahead. I wrote to my friend who is now in the bunker in East Jerusalem, dealing with Gaza. Mr. Tiro was my colleague in Bangladesh. Vietnam, the UN comes first, and the UN leave last. Our thoughts are with our colleagues over there. But I would like briefly to go back, David, to what John and you told me when I joined you some time ago about the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflict. It seems that the COVID is a bit now under control, but the other 2 C's are really raising out of the roof. You're going soon, I believe, with some colleagues to Dubai to the COVID-28. Maybe we can have a few words on this also. But I would like to emphasize what Uma Leda also put out in our book, Food for All, the enormous amount of money we spend daily now on armament. The global arm race is still have no limits. And I would very much that we also reflect a little bit on that, because we can work on many things in the world on food systems, but if we don't have the right funding, I believe that the funds are not going to the right place at the moment. And it's really amazing what happens these days in the world with 2 different wars going on. David, we spoke the other day on a few important items, but really don't get loose of that aspect that happily enough, it seems that some humanitarian access is coming now to the Gaza, but that war must stop. We spend too much money every day on arms, which is not necessary. So that is my contribution.
Thank you. It makes a lot of good sense, David. And do you want to react to that?
First of all, I wanted to really stress that Ad Spikers, in quoting Uma Lele's book, Food for All, has perhaps pointed us towards what I believe is one of the best collations of the issues around access to food and nutrition that I've enjoyed. Thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you also for stressing about the way in which conflict, climate change, COVID, and the cost of living crisis are all having a dramatic impact on people's food security everywhere. This is something that we continue to worry about through the Global Crisis Response Group. So everything that you said, I would encourage everybody to hold on to. I also, now I'm speaking, I want to say that I may have made, perhaps not a mistake, but I may have been unwise in quoting what I had read in a book from somebody who, the parts that I read I found quite interesting, but it turns out from those of you who know him better than me, that he has stirred up quite a nest of controversy, and I am being helped to see that through some comments in the chat. Thank you to those of you who've shared them. Good, back to you, Florence.
One addition, Florence, if you allow me. There is today a very good piece in The Guardian about this global arms race and how the West is perceiving that and how the global South is perceiving that. I will send that around, and maybe some of you are interested to read that.
Thank you very much. Definitely interested to read more about this. Thank you, Ad. Any last contributor for our conversation today? The chat is very busy and super interesting. Localization of food systems, of where to dialogue. Thank you, Florence and Denise in particular. But any other comment or person who want to say a word? So David, how do you want to wrap us up for today?
Thanks a lot. First of all, I'm really grateful to those of you who've focused on some of the ongoing challenges linked to COVID-19 and the fact that this does need continued attention and in particular that how health systems work needs a lot of special attention. I am still wondering what all this means for public health. 5 years ago, public health professionals could make firm statements about risk based on analyses and projections and be treated as people who were contributing to the public good. Now, when public health professionals make statements about risk, they are likely to end up being quite heavily critiqued if they are saying things that go against some perceived set of norms. And so it's put public health into a different place, to the point where at a meeting I attended just 2 weeks ago on the future of the UK health service, I hear people who are preparing for the forthcoming general election say it's very difficult indeed for government in Britain to be giving any advice on what folks should eat, because it leads to immediate criticism from certain kinds of newspaper that they are promoting the notion of the nanny state. So all of us working in public health need to find ways to pursue the advisory functions that we take on, and to keep being able to do this despite the possibility of getting quite massively attacked on social media and the like. So holding that. Number two, I wanted to really appreciate the comments that have been made on the impact of violence on public health and the opportunities for achieving equity. And that kind of links a bit to the work that those of us who are systems leaders have to do to encourage ways to hold dissonance within groups. And I'm particularly grateful for that. And then the third one on the convergence of climate and food systems. Clearly, this is something that many of you have got views on, and that has stimulated a really strong and exciting exchange in the chat. I wanted then to pick up on me quoting from an author who clearly I didn't know much about. It was a book that I picked up and read at an airport. And there are things perhaps that I ought to have known that I didn't know. And that leads me to want to just remind you and remind me to be careful in that sort of thing. Thank you again, those of you who put comments in here, for what you have said. And with that, I think I've gone on too long. I'm most grateful to everybody for being prepared to engage in these challenging and difficult issues in which we find ourselves. If only there were clean, straightforward solutions that we could all align behind and feel good about, then it would make our lives an awful lot easier, but it's not like that. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
And we would not need to devise about them. Thank you all for your engagement, your participation, your contribution. As Tui was putting in the chat, let's keep the conversation going into the LinkedIn group in particular. And let's meet again in a month, I think it is. Same space, same people, keeping the conversation. Thank you all. We leave it there for today. Wishing you a very good rest of today and a nice weekend. Bye-bye.